Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in the Arkansas Delta. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. In the spring of 1879, a low mist clung to the fields along the Mississippi's western bank. The sun rose over an endless flat plain, broken only by winding bayous and clusters of dead trees. It was in one of the more remote reaches of the Delta, in a sparsely settled stretch of Phillips County, Arkansas, that Mrs. Eliza Halbrook's estate stood, half swallowed by swamp and thick, humid air. County maps show her property nestled between drainage ditches and levees, far from the nearest steamboat landing. Local lore had long whispered about the Halbrook homestead, how it sat on drained marshland, how previous owners had abandoned it after tragic deaths, how crows circled thickly above its walls. In deed records from 1872, the land passed through several hands before Eliza's husband died suddenly in 1878, leaving her sole proprietor. According to an 1880 inspection by the county surveyor, the house was of plain frame construction, 2 stories, gabled roof, verandas closed in with boards. The surrounding soil was soggy, and the ground shifted at night. Neighbors remarked that the structure creaked as though alive. That year, a traveling circuit preacher named Jonathan Merritt stopped in a nearby village wondering aloud at Martha Halbrook's resolve. "A widow inhospitable to none," he recorded in his journal, yet rumored in whispers to harbor secrets. His journal, later seized by local constables, would become one of the few external sources to the unfolding events. Within months of her arrival as sole occupant, odd things began. On the first night, a passing sharecropper named Amos Bryant claimed he saw dim lantern light moving behind the shutters of the Halbrook house long after dusk. He dared not approach, but swore he heard muffled voices. A month later, a child belonging to a nearby tenant family vanished. No trace, no footprints, no wheel ruts, nothing disturbed in the marsh grass. Rumors spread in the county seat. "The widow entertains more than dinner guests," one newspaper clipping scrawled in 1880. Court documents show that in June, the sheriff's deputy, Thomas Leeds, attempted a visit. He approached the veranda and knocked. A voice called softly inside, "Come in, sir, if your business is kind." But when Leeds pushed the door, he was met by dusk and silence. In his report, he noted damp soil footprints at the threshold leading toward a back wing, but nothing more. Those early incidents barely scratched the surface, but they drew attention. Some speculated Mrs. Halbrook was hiding displaced persons or runaway laborers. Others whispered of darker fates. Yet all official correspondence remained inconclusive. The Arkansas Delta region, as referenced in historical accounts, was known for such remote, nearly inaccessible tracts, making thorough investigation slow and dangerous. Wikipedia. The summer of 1879 settled heavy and breathless over the Arkansas Delta. Mosquitoes droned in clouds, and the levee roads cracked beneath the heat. In this stillness, the Halbrook estate seemed untouched by time. Its shutters closed, its chimney breathing faint smoke, the porch sagging under its own weight. According to entries in the Helena Weekly Clarion, townsfolk had begun calling it the supper house, for it was said that once a guest entered near evening, few ever saw them return. Neighbors could recall only brief encounters. Mrs. Eliza Halbrook herself, tall and pale, wore mourning black even under the noon sun. She spoke little, though when she did, her voice carried a strange calm that unsettled most men. A merchant named Willard Tye claimed she came to his store in June to buy salted meat and kerosene in unusual quantities, enough to feed a whole congregation. He joked to his clerk before realizing she did not laugh. The sheriff's deputy, Thomas Leeds, the same man who had once heard the voice invite him in, filed another report later that month. He described returning to the property after dark, lantern in hand. "The woman met me upon the veranda," he wrote. "She did not deny visitors, only asked that I not wander the rear rooms." Leeds recalled the faint odor of iron and vinegar and a thick dampness in the air. He noted a table set for 6, though no other figures were present. By midsummer, 3 more disappearances were quietly logged in the county register. Each involved itinerant laborers bound for Memphis or Pine Bluff, who had last been seen near the Halbrook Road. No formal charges were ever brought. The sheriff's office lacked resources. and the marshes were near impassable that season. In later years, regional historians would cite this pattern as typical of the post-Reconstruction Arkansas Delta, when law enforcement was scarce and records easily lost. Paraphrased from Arkansas Delta Wikipedia. Among the few surviving testimonies was one from Reverend Merritt, the itinerant preacher. He returned in August to find the house shuttered and silent. The stillness of death itself, he wrote. Yet there was food set upon the table, as if for travelers soon expected. He described plates half filled, candles burned down to wax puddles, and a Bible open to the Book of Ruth. The entry ended abruptly. I believe she waits for company. Later examination of Merritt's notebook showed smudges of red clay and a small scrap of fabric caught between pages. Some scholars, writing decades afterward, speculated he may have glimpsed one of Mrs. Halbrook's endless suppers firsthand, a gathering that existed only long enough to swallow those who attended. The local paper printed one more notice that year: missing Samuel Raines, a peddler traveling the Delta roads. Beneath his description, a single line: last known stop, Widow Halbrook's. By the time autumn crept in, the Delta's fog thickened, and so too did the silence around the house. Few dared speak of it aloud. The region itself seemed to close its throat over the story, the way the river swallows debris and drifts on, as if nothing ever happened. By October of 1879, the Arkansas Delta began to cool. The cotton fields turned brittle, and the air smelled faintly of burning cane. In those months, several residents of the nearby hamlet of Trenton claimed they could see a faint orange glow on the horizon, the direction of the Halbrook estate. Some said it was her lamps burning late into the night. Others whispered it was firelight from beneath the earth itself. A farmhand named Lester Baird later gave a statement in Phillips County Justice records that he'd passed the Halbrook property one foggy morning and seen a row of coats hung like trophies along the veranda railing. He swore they weren't there when he'd walked the same road 2 days earlier. When he returned with a neighbor to confirm, the porch was empty. Only a faint smell of cooked grain lingered in the air. That same month, Reverend Merritt's horse was found tethered near the levee, riderless. His belongings remained in the saddlebags: Bible, letters, small coins. The local constable, Samuel Pruitt, organized a brief search. For 3 days, men dragged the edge of the bayou behind the Halbrook tract. On the third morning, one of them, a young deputy named Cale Dunson, found a patch of disturbed soil near the cypress grove. When they dug, they uncovered only a bundle of scorched cloth and bone fragments too small to name. The coroner's note listed them as non-human, possibly livestock, but those who handled the remains whispered otherwise. According to later retellings preserved in the Arkansas Historical Quarterly, this period marked the height of suspicion around Mrs. Halbrook. She was seen less frequently in town, yet her chimney was never cold. The same record mentions the Arkansas Delta's growing infamy for isolated homesteads and vanishing travelers, and a trait that historians would much later connect to the area's rough, post-war lawlessness and decaying infrastructure. A nod again to the region described in the Arkansas Delta Wikipedia entry. One merchant, recalling his encounter years afterward, described her eyes as gray and still like water before a storm. Another villager swore she'd glimpsed 2 silhouettes standing behind Mrs. Halbrook at a window, both men, both motionless, though she could not recall their faces. A letter dated November 3, 1879, surfaced decades later in the state archives. It was written by Dr. Emmett Collier, a physician from Helena, who'd once treated Mrs. Halbrook for nervous fainting and disturbed sleep. In his account, she complained of phantom callers at her gate and footsteps under the floor. Collier dismissed it as melancholia, but noted her insistence that those she fed would never truly leave. By year's end, the Halbrook homestead had become a point of fearful fascination. Passing travelers began avoiding the road entirely, choosing instead to add miles of detour through the swamps. The parish ledger records the burial of 3 unidentified persons that December, all found in shallow graves along the bayou's edge. And yet through all of this, no warrant was ever issued. No search was ever sanctioned. The sheriff's office, underfunded and overworked, simply let the matter fade into the fog, where it belonged, or so they hoped. The dawn of 1880 brought with it a thick frost that settled over the Arkansas Delta like a funeral cloth. The marshes stiffened, the rivers slowed, and for a few months the Halbrook place vanished into silence. But silence in that land was rarely peace. When the spring thaw came, farmhands from neighboring tracts began to speak again, soft, nervous talk about sounds from the Halbrook woods. A sharecropper named Elias Crow reported hammering after dark, and something heavy being dragged. His wife swore she heard laughter, but not the kind from joy, the kind from a bad dream. The Helena Weekly Clarion printed a curious notice that March, Constable Leeds revisits the Halbrook estate upon new reports of vagrancy and foul odours. The deputy's log described entering the front parlour with 2 assistants. Inside they found the long table still set, though the dishes were cracked and furred with mould. In one bowl lay a clump of dirt mixed with what he called something pale as candle tallow. Leeds also mentioned the presence of small mounds outside the house, 6, evenly spaced, though no formal excavation followed. The report ended abruptly with, "Owner uncooperative, claims all is well, insists supper is to be served." Folklore later named those mounds the Delta seats, as if each marked a guest who never left the table. Rural storytellers in Phillips County kept that phrase alive for generations. Amid the growing unease, Mrs. Halbrook continued to send letters to the county clerk, requesting that her property taxes be handled in person after the next gathering. None ever came to collect. One element that surfaced again in later studies of the region, particularly in the Arkansas Delta historical accounts, Wikipedia paraphrased, was how isolation shaped local myth. Entire families lived weeks without contact, and disappearances often blurred between fact and superstition. The Halbrook case, many believe, was born of this isolation, a fear projected upon a woman alone in the wilderness. Yet others argue the records, thin as they are, hint at something more deliberate. In May of 1880, 2 fishermen from the White River settlement claimed to see smoke rising from the Halbrook chimney at odd hours. When they passed closer, they found the yard littered with cracked porcelain and an overturned chair at the threshold. One swore he heard the faint ring of cutlery. Neither returned. By that summer, the house was effectively abandoned. A traveling merchant found its doors open, pantry bare, and an unfinished meal crusted upon the dining table. There were no bodies, no signs of violence, only chairs askew and a lingering smell of meat gone sour. The merchant's testimony was filed, then lost in flood damage to the county courthouse a few years later. What remained was rumor that those who entered after the widow's vanishing heard whispers of a woman reciting grace, though no one could locate the voice. Even decades later, the Arkansas Delta would be cited by researchers as a graveyard of unrecorded crimes, its marshes hiding more than history would ever admit. By 1881, the widow's house had already begun to rot. The boards buckled under humidity, the porch vines thickened like veins, and the roof sagged inward. A farmer who leased adjoining land, Mr. Franklin Doss, recalled seeing candlelight flicker through the warped shutters one night in April, even though the place was said to be long deserted. He and 2 hired hands approached, thinking squatters had moved in. What they found, he later told the Phillips County Inquest Committee, was an open parlor filled with overturned furniture and dishes caked in mold. On the mantel sat a single silver fork, polished and clean. The floorboards beneath it were darker, stained as though scrubbed many times. They left before dawn, frightened by a sound that Doss described as someone sweeping in the next room, though there was no floor left to sweep. That spring also brought renewed attention from outside the county. A journalist from the Memphis Appeal, Henry C. Alcott, traveled into the Delta to investigate local disappearances. His surviving article, Widow of the Swamp Road, was brief and cautious, but it mentioned one important connection. Alcott compared the case to an 1870s string of disappearances near St. Francis County, referencing an earlier regional pattern of isolation and lawlessness in the Arkansas Delta. A detail paralleling modern historical summaries found in the Arkansas Delta entry on Wikipedia. Alcott stayed 3 nights in Helena, interviewing townsfolk. He wrote of their nervous laughter when the Halbrook name was mentioned, as if it were both a joke and a warning. His published report drew little attention at the time, but in later years it became one of the only surviving period accounts of the mystery. That same year, a flood struck the region, tearing through levees and drowning entire fields. Many said it was divine judgment. A handful of residents took advantage of the chaos to burn the Halbrook house down, or so they claimed afterward. Yet when surveyors returned weeks later, the structure still stood, scorched but upright, the chimney intact, as if it refused to surrender, one report said. In the years following the flood, the site became a point of quiet pilgrimage for the curious and the reckless. Children dared each other to step onto the porch and listen for voices. Some claimed to hear dishes clinking, faint laughter, or the low hum of a hymn. The adults, though, simply looked away. They said the ground there was soft, that boots sank deeper than they should. As the decade passed, the Delta's stories grew more tangled. By 1885, the widow's name had entered local folklore. Preachers warned of the feast that never ends, and traveling salesmen swore off the road entirely. The Arkansas Delta, as referenced in later academic studies, was already earning its reputation as a place where roads go missing before people do. And still, no one could say for certain when Mrs. Eliza Halbrook herself disappeared, or if she ever did. Some travelers swore they saw her figure at dusk, standing on the veranda with a lantern, waiting for guests who never came. Others insisted the house remained occupied long after her death, but by whom no one dared ask. By the winter of 1886, the Halbrook estate had taken on the stillness of a mausoleum. The river fog settled low, swallowing the yard and road alike. Farmers traveling the levee road spoke of seeing a lantern swaying on the porch, as if someone was still waiting to be received. Few were willing to approach, though everyone in the Arkansas Delta knew the outline of that house against the evening mist. One of the last official references to the property appeared in a tattered volume of Phillips County Surveyor's reports. Dated January 1886, it described one dwelling, condition unsound, possibly inhabited by vagrants. Yet scribbled in the margin was a different note in another hand: no entry beyond threshold, voices audible within. It was around this time that Professor Edmund Grayson, a visiting historian from Little Rock College, began documenting folklore of the Delta. In his later lectures, some preserved by the Arkansas Historical Association, he mentioned the Halbrook case as an example of regional haunting by circumstance rather than spirit. Grayson believed the story emerged from the psychological isolation of post-Reconstruction settlers, cut off by floods and superstition. He cited the same agricultural hardships and social stagnation found throughout the Arkansas Delta, a contextual echo from the Wikipedia entry, where tragedy and rumor became one and the same. But even Grayson's skeptical tone couldn't erase what locals claimed to have seen. A midwife named Nora Winfield told in her affidavit that she had been called to the Halbrook place one evening to tend to a woman in frail health. When she arrived, she found the front door ajar and the parlor lit with oil lamps. There were plates upon the table, she said, and chairs all drawn close as if they were listening. Winfield left without announcing herself. When she returned 2 days later with another villager, the lamps were out and the table bare. In her old age, she insisted that she had smelled lilac water and broth as she fled down the road, scents that lingered long after the house had disappeared behind her. By 1888, the county clerk's ledgers stopped referencing Mrs. Halbrook entirely. Taxes went unpaid, yet no one foreclosed on the property. One sheriff, questioned years later, said simply, "We knew who it belonged to, and that was enough." The structure endured through storms that leveled newer buildings. 1890 floods swept away barns and bridges, but left the widow's house untouched. Witnesses said the waters split around it like two halves of a river meeting an island. Superstitious or not, the Delta folk began avoiding even the road that led there. By century's end, the Halbrook estate had already drifted from fact into folklore, cited by journalists, then preachers, then teachers warning restless children. Yet the old county files, warped and water-stained, whispered something quieter, that at least 8 persons vanished between 1879 and 1885 along that stretch of road, and none were found. The Delta swallowed them whole as it does so many things, slowly, patiently, without protest. By 1891, the Halbrook property had become a local wound, one everyone knew but no one dared touch. The house leaned like a drunk against the mist, its chimney crooked and black. Travelers claimed that In the half-light before dawn, they could see a figure at the table, head bowed, as if still saying grace. A new constable, Elliot Breen, decided to settle the matter once and for all. Breen was young, idealistic, and recently transferred from Little Rock. He rode out in March with 2 deputies carrying a warrant for property inspection. The entry in his log is short but chilling. Arrived at the Halbrook estate. Front door open. Odor of decay and wet earth. Found dining table intact with 6 chairs arranged, dustless, left before dusk. No sign of owner. That was Breen's last visit. Within weeks he resigned and moved north to Missouri. He never gave a reason. In the same year, local farmers began reporting something stranger. Missing livestock found days later in their pens, untouched, but arranged in circles. The rumor spread that the ground itself had grown hungry, that what was buried beneath the Halbrook home had started to reach outward. Most dismissed it as flood-borne hysteria, the kind that came when the rivers swelled and nerves frayed. A letter dated May 1892, found decades later in the attic of a county clerk's building, offered a rare private glimpse. Written by a retired preacher, Reverend Leland Burke, it read, "Her house is not empty. It listens. When the wind turns north, you can hear her hum the psalm she favored at supper. God forgive her solitude." Burke's handwriting trailed off, but the letter bore the seal of Phillips County Parish. The same document made a passing mention to a Mrs. Halbrook, seen walking near the levee, holding what appeared to be a prayer book. The date of sighting, 13 years after her supposed disappearance. That account, later analyzed by Professor Grayson, aligned with his theory that the Arkansas Delta, due to its isolation and fragmented record-keeping, often blurred living memory with myth. This observation echoes descriptions in the Arkansas Delta historical reference, which emphasizes how scattered communities shaped their own folklore. Still, there were enough corroborating details to unsettle even skeptics. The widowed housekeeper of a nearby plantation told her niece that on stormy nights she saw faint lamplight flickering through the bayou trees. A supper still going, though the guests been dead a while. By 1894, a fire destroyed much of the county courthouse. Countless property files were lost, including the Halbrook deed and Breen's inspection notes. It was said that the fire began in a locked cabinet where seized personal effects were stored, items rumored to have come from the Halbrook estate. The official report blamed lightning. Unofficially, folks said the fire started because something was finally trying to be forgotten. Yet memory, like the swamp, rarely lets go. By the turn of 1895, a generation had passed since the first whispers of the widow Halbrook's endless suppers. Most who remembered her were grey and weary, though none would speak her name after dark. The younger folk treated the story like a dare, a test of bravery or foolishness. That spring, 3 teenage boys from Helena crossed the bayou to prove they could spend a night in the old house. Only one, Caleb Wren, returned. His statement, given under oath to Sheriff Delmar Hoyt, was brief. "We went in before sundown. The place was quiet except for the boards creaking. I swear we heard someone humming from the parlor, like an old hymn. By midnight, the candles wouldn't stay lit. Then someone said, 'Supper's ready.' That's when I ran." The sheriff marked it down as hysteria. No further questions were asked. The 2 other boys were never found. In the following months, the Delta's quiet dread deepened. Families began leaving the area near the Halbrook tract altogether, moving closer to the levee towns. The few who stayed reported that dogs refused to cross the road leading toward the property, whining and digging their paws into the dirt. A curious note from this period survives in the private journal of Dr. Abram Keller, a physician who served much of the Phillips County region between 1893 and 1901. He wrote that one evening, while visiting a patient, he saw light through the trees, steady, like a lantern hung high. The patient, an old farmer, told him flatly, "That's her house again." She set another table. Keller added a final line, "The Delta eats its own." The Arkansas Delta, as later described in state surveys and summarized in historical sources like Wikipedia, was infamous for its vanished settlements, entire hamlets swallowed by shifting rivers and floods. The Halbrook property became one of those places, gradually omitted from new maps, its boundaries absorbed by replatted farmland. But local deeds still listed it as Lot 13 Old River Bend, an echo of ownership no one dared claim. One of the few who tried, Mr. Hugh Reynard, a lumberman from Monroe County, purchased the parcel at auction in 1897. He intended to dismantle the house for timber. The attempt lasted only a single morning. His crew quit before noon, claiming that the floorboards sounded hollow, like something breathing below. Reynard himself left a brief affidavit. Tools rusted overnight. Nails would not hold. Left at sunrise. Let it stand. He was found dead 2 months later, face down in a field clutching a small dinner fork. After that, no one bid on the property again. For a time, the Halbrook story faded. Not solved, not silenced, just buried beneath newer tragedies and newer floods. But the Delta remembers. The people of Helena say that when the mist rolls low over the water and the frogs go quiet, you can still hear a voice, a woman's voice, asking if you'll stay for supper. By 1898, the Arkansas Delta entered another cycle of hardship. The river rose again. Fields drowned and entire settlements vanished beneath the slow-moving flood. Yet amid the devastation, one thing persisted. The foundation of the Halbrook estate standing above the waterline like a spine of brick and bone. When the flood receded, curious townsmen from Helena rode out to survey the damage. Among them was Deputy Marshal Ephraim Cole, who recorded his observations in a brief dispatch now kept in the county's fragmentary archives. The Halbrook dwelling stands partly submerged. Interior visible through collapsed wall. Table remains upright. Upon it, dishes unbroken though the ceiling fallen. Cole's party did not linger. They noted no footprints in the surrounding mud, only a strange smoothness, as though the soil had been pressed flat by something weightless. That same season, a traveling schoolteacher named Ada Lorne passed through the Delta, collecting local legends for a pamphlet on rural folklore. Her handwritten notes, rediscovered in 1930, mentioned the Halbrook house 3 times, once as a site of unending supper, once as the widow's dining place by the swamp, and finally as proof that some griefs cannot die, only eat. Lorne cross-referenced the tale with regional histories of the Arkansas Delta, consistent with descriptions in the Wikipedia entry, remarking that its people treat memory as inheritance, to be passed down, whether cursed or true. Her account marks the last first-hand mention of anyone willingly visiting the property before the century closed. Around 1900, the estate's outline faded from new survey maps altogether. The land was reclassified as unstable marshland. Still, in letters between clerks and parsons, the name surfaced, Halbrook Tract, unassessed, as though the record itself resisted erasure. One curious piece of evidence from that year came from Dr. Kellor, the same physician who had once glimpsed lantern light in the trees. He noted that flooding had unearthed portions of the cellar, bricks, damp timbers, and one low archway leading into nothing. Inside, he found a rusted spoon fused to the floor by sediment. He took it back to town, intending to clean and keep it as a curiosity, but within days it turned black with tarnish and began to flake apart. He wrote, "Perhaps it's the river air, or perhaps the house won't let go of what's hers." By 1902, the Halbrook land was spoken of only in whispers at the general store or in the corners of taverns. When men drank too long, they swore they'd seen a glow from the far bend of the levee, faint orange, steady. One fisherman even rowed toward it, thinking it was a campfire, only to find nothing but reeds and a slick of oil on the water's surface. And yet, despite every burned record and lost file, the story persisted. Like the Delta's soil itself, rich, black, and full of what time refuses to forget. The new century brought rail lines, levees, and factories to the Arkansas Delta, but progress rarely reached the backwater where the Halbrook house once stood. By 1904, maps labeled the area abandoned tract, and the main road that once ran past the property had been rerouted farther north. Even so, travelers along the levee claimed that on humid nights, the old route still appeared beneath the mist, a pale ribbon of dirt leading nowhere. In that same year, a federal land surveyor named Robert C. Fenner was sent to remeasure parcels damaged by repeated flooding. His notebook, later found in the archives of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, contains a single line about the Halbrook tract. Encountered foundation stones, heavy odor, distant singing from the direction of the cypress. Fenner was not a man given to superstition. He underlined the word singing twice and added in the margin, female voice, him unknown. He never filed a full report. Colleagues recalled that he refused further assignments in Phillips County. Around that time, a small academic circle in Little Rock revived interest in the Delta's vanishing settlements. Among them was Professor Edmund Grayson, whose lectures on rural anxieties of the Reconstruction South used the Halbrook case as a cautionary example of myth-shaping memory. He pointed to how stories like it, told around the firelight of isolated farms, reflected a culture's loneliness more than its evil. Grayson referenced regional documentation of the Arkansas Delta's depopulation, paralleling details preserved in state histories and the same Wikipedia entry today: wide tracts of land abandoned after economic decline and recurring floods. But while Grayson sought reason, others found fear. Local letters from that period show the legend taking on new life. One, written by a reverend's wife in 1905, reads, "The widowed house is not empty. It feeds still. Children cry out in dreams that they've been called to supper, and their mouths are cold when they wake." In 1907, a flood once again swept through the region, destroying what little remained of the old Halbrook structure. Or so people thought. After the waters receded, the chimney still stood, and beneath it, fragments of china were discovered, perfectly aligned in a circle as though laid out by careful hands. A local reporter from the Helena World covered the finding in a short column titled "Ghost Table in the Swamp." The article drew laughter in town, but discomfort in the countryside. For the next decade, few dared speak of it again, but hunters crossing the marsh said they'd occasionally stumble upon pieces of porcelain glinting beneath the reeds, or a rusted utensil half buried in silt. One trapper swore he found a fork embedded upright in a tree trunk. The land, they said, had learned to keep its own table. And though the house was gone, the story refused to drown, a faint echo woven into every tale told in the Arkansas Delta whenever the fog rolled in thick and the river went quiet. By 1910, the Arkansas Delta had entered a strange peace. Railways buzzed in the north, but in the low southern reaches, time had stopped. The Halbrook land, now overgrown and nameless, was marked only by cypress stumps and one leaning chimney. Hunters called it the Widow's Stack. That year, Jonas T. Merrin, a part-time journalist from Pine Bluff, ventured into the marsh with a photographer. His surviving notes describe a narrow path lined with dinner plates sunk into the soil like stepping stones. Most were cracked, rimmed with black mildew, but several bore initials, E.H. The initials matched property records for Eliza Halbrook, the widow who had first come to the Delta in 1879. Merrin's report, Feast in the Fog, was never published, though fragments survived in the Arkansas Historical Society's correspondence files. One passage read, "The plates are not scattered by chance. They are arranged facing east as if awaiting sunrise. The air holds the sweetness of rot and old perfume." The photographer's plates, ironically the glass kind, were found damaged, melted as if by fire. But Merrin's field assistant, Walter Cleaves, later told his grandchildren that one image did survive, a blurred silhouette in the fog, seated at what seemed a long table beneath the trees. No one has seen that photograph since. Meanwhile, academic interest flickered again. A professor of anthropology from the University of Arkansas, Dr. C.L. Henry, collected oral histories across Phillips and Monroe counties. He found that the Halbrook tale remained consistent: a widow, a feast, and guests who never left. In one version, she cooked to atone for her husband's death. In another, she lured travelers to feed an unseen thing beneath her house. Henry summarized the myth as the hunger of isolation, drawing parallels with accounts of grief and superstition, documented throughout the Arkansas Delta, as preserved in regional studies later. Summarized on Wikipedia, he concluded, "It may not matter whether she killed or merely hosted, both acts served the same need, to be remembered." Still, some physical traces remained. In 1912, a levee crew repairing embankments near Old River Bend unearthed fragments of what they first took for driftwood. Closer inspection revealed cut beams and square nails, remnants of a house built decades earlier. Among the debris was a tarnished brooch engraved with the initials M.H., possibly belonging to one of the earliest victims. The crew foreman, an Irish immigrant named Keenan, ordered the pieces reburied. "No man builds on bones," he was quoted saying. After that, the land was left untouched. Locals swore that when the river wind blew through the reeds, it carried the faint clatter of dishes. Some nights, people camping along the levee said they smelled stew, onions, salt pork and wine, drifting from the trees. Whether memory or miasma, it was enough. The people of the Delta stopped going near the place, letting it sink quietly into its own legend. By 1913, the Halbrook story had become a kind of whispered inheritance in the Arkansas Delta. Children heard it from their grandparents, who still lowered their voices when saying her name. Farmers ploughing near the marsh edge would pause at sundown, glancing toward the distant cypress line, as if expecting movement there. That summer, a heat wave dried the swamps enough that an out-of-town survey crew, sent from Helena to replot agricultural land, inadvertently crossed into the old Halbrook tract. The leader, surveyor Nathaniel Drum, recorded the day in his field book, soil soft and oddly fragrant with patches of white residue, found several depressions resembling shallow graves but without remains. Crew uneasy. I've marked the area as unfit for farming. Drum was a man of reason, educated in St. Louis, skeptical of folklore. Yet that same evening he wrote another note on the back of the page. Heard a woman's voice reciting grace. No wind present. The account would have been dismissed entirely, if not for the disappearance of one of his assistants, Harold Jett, 2 days later. Jett's tools were discovered near the site, along with his hat and measuring rod. No search turned up a body. His absence was quietly blamed on desertion, but Drum resigned within the month, stating privately that he would not take the Delta's work again. A Helena World columnist revived public interest soon after, publishing an article titled The Widow's Feast, Truth or Terror. The piece traced the rumor from 1879 to the present and interviewed elders who recalled the first sheriff's inquiries. One quote from that column remains haunting. She cooked for everyone who came, and when they were gone, the table stayed full. During this time, the Arkansas Delta continued to earn its reputation as a land where water and memory mingled, where every flood unearthed old bones and older stories. Historians writing decades later, and summarized in the same Wikipedia reference, noted that the region's oral traditions blurred crime with myth, feeding legends like the widow Halbrooks until they felt older than the land itself. By autumn, another visitor arrived, a pastor named Reverend Eli McCord from Tunica County, Mississippi. He intended to pray over the property, hoping to lift its shadow. His travel diary, preserved by his church, includes one brief line written on the last day before he vanished. The air is heavy here. Someone has already set the table. Weeks later, his horse was found tied to a cypress stump. The saddlebag held only his Bible and a note, "Grace before meat." Locals said the widow had claimed another guest. By winter's first frost, the Halbrook tract disappeared again under floodwater. Ice formed on the bayou edges, and the reeds bowed low as if even the land itself were weary of remembering. Still the people whispered, not in fear but in uneasy reverence, for in the Delta, forgetting is its own kind of curse. By 1915, the Halbrook tract had been formally written off in county ledgers as unrecoverable land. No one claimed ownership. No new tax records appeared. The locals called it simply the supper ground. And though the once solid house had long since sunk into the muck, stories continued to rise from that spot like swamp gas. That spring, a small crew from the Arkansas Geological Survey arrived to test the soil's mineral content. Among them was Clara Hewson, one of the first women survey assistants in the region. Her field journal, now preserved at the University of Arkansas, contained one cryptic entry dated April 8, 1915. Evening sample site coordinates near Old River Bend. Found remains of stone foundation. The ground trembles faintly. Smell of something cooking. When her supervisor, Mr. Beecham, was later questioned, he admitted that Clara had returned to camp pale and silent. She said she'd heard dishes, he told an interviewer years later, like a table being set right under the soil. That same year, the Helena newspaper printed an anniversary piece marking 36 years since the widow's feast. It reprinted fragments of the 1880 reports and added new witness recollections. One particularly chilling quote came from a boatman named Russell Quinn, who ferried timber workers across the bayou. "Some nights I see a fire low on the water, steady and red. When I row closer, it's gone, but I swear I can smell stew, rich, thick, like something still simmering." Historians would later note that the Arkansas Delta especially during the early 20th century, was prone to this kind of haunting geography, a blend of swamp decay, isolation, and generational memory. As described in modern summaries such as the Arkansas Delta Wikipedia entry, this combination of flooding and loss produced legends that blurred the real with the remembered. For a few months after the article, a handful of curious travelers ventured out, hoping to find remains of the endless supper house. They found only broken china and the outline of a brick hearth. Yet every one of them later reported illness, fever, stomach pains, and a metallic taste in their mouths. No explanation was ever recorded. When the summer storms came, the lowlands flooded once again. Locals said the river wanted the house back. A family living 3 miles away swore they saw the flicker of lamplight moving slowly through the fog, not floating but walking. Afterward, even the boldest refused to go near the place. Ferry operators refused to dock anywhere within sight of the Cypress Bend. Hunters claimed that when the wind blew from the east, they could hear the faint clinking of glass and the scrape of chairs on wood. And so the Halbrook story passed quietly into its next generation. Less a crime, more a haunting memory of what hunger, grief, and solitude can become when the world forgets you. By the spring of 1917, the world beyond the Arkansas Delta was at war. Yet here time still drifted like silt in water. The wider country moved on. The Delta did not. It remained a place of mud roads, empty barns, and old names buried under deeper silence. That March, an aging newspaper editor named Oscar Vail revisited the story of the widow Halbrook for the Helena Daily World. His feature, Legends from the Lower Bayou, aimed to collect fading local tales before they were lost. Vail interviewed elders, ferrymen, and retired deputies, men who had seen too much fog and too many floods. They all remembered her differently. One claimed she had been a nurse during the yellow fever years, forced into solitude after losing her family. Another insisted she was no widow at all, but an undertaker's daughter who inherited an old boarding house. Yet each story ended the same way, with a table set for 6 and guests who never left. In the middle of Vail's article, he referenced an 1880 county affidavit from Deputy Thomas Leeds, one of the earliest officers to set foot in the Halbrook home, and included this haunting line: "If it were not for the smell of meat, one might have believed the house uninhabited." The editor drew a parallel between this testimony and the region's broader melancholy. He cited academic works of the time, describing the Arkansas Delta as a geography of endurance and forgetting, a phrase now echoed in the Wikipedia summary of the same region, noting how its isolation preserved both its soil and its ghosts. Vail's article caused a quiet stir. Letters poured in from readers claiming to know descendants of the widow, or to have found pieces of her china washed up along the levee. One anonymous writer sent the newsroom a small package wrapped in oilcloth. Inside was a fork polished clean, tied with a ribbon of faded black lace. No note, no address. Only the initials EH scratched faintly near the handle. The paper printed no follow-up, but Vail himself reportedly stopped taking the river road home after dark. In a letter to his wife, he wrote, "I can't explain it, but every time the train whistle sounds, I smell stew." Meanwhile, nearby residents began reporting new disturbances, faint lights over the marsh at night, sometimes in rows, sometimes moving in slow circles. Farmers dismissed it as methane fires. Still, the older folks said softly, "She's cooking again." That summer, a series of small fires swept through the cane fields near Old River Bend. The flames stopped just short of where the Halbrook property had once stood. When questioned, one farmhand claimed he saw figures in the smoke. 3 men and a woman seated. No one went to check. As the year drew to a close, the Arkansas Delta settled into another long silence. War telegrams reached the towns, and the legend of the widow receded again into the shadows of newer griefs. But in quiet corners, some still swore that when the mist rolled in, you could smell her suppers warming the night. By 1919, the war had ended, and soldiers began trickling back to the Arkansas Delta. The land was battered but fertile again, its fields breathing out steam after the rains. Many men returned to find their homes gone, taken by flood, debt, or neglect. Some settled wherever dry ground remained, and a few built shacks unknowingly close to the long-forgotten Halbrook tract. One of them, Private James Rowe, left behind a diary that would resurface in a family trunk a century later. In it he wrote, "The men won't stay long. They say the air smells wrong. Last night I heard laughter out by the trees, soft, like a woman humming a hymn. I thought it might be one of the sharecropper wives, but there's no one living that far down the road." He went on to describe finding fragments of porcelain in the mud, still arranged in a semicircle. When he touched one, he said it was warm, as if it had just been washed. In early 1920, a county inspector performing flood recovery assessments filed a report that briefly revived official attention. He described the area as notable for abnormal subsidence, noting that the ground seemed to rise and fall by inches, as though breathing. The report's appendix mentioned remnants of cutlery, likely domestic in nature, embedded in the soil. When the inspector returned weeks later, those items were gone. Locals took this as proof that the widow's table had set itself again. That same year, a letter appeared in the Arkansas Gazette, written by Professor Edmund Grayson, now in his later years. He revisited the Halbrook legend as an example of how the Arkansas Delta's isolation and hardship created a folklore of endurance, stories that feed on memory as bodies once fed on bread. His words echoed modern analyses of the region's culture, like the ID Arkansas Delta account on Wikipedia, arguing that tragedy in such lands is never buried, only repurposed into warning. Grayson also confessed quietly that he had once visited the Halbrook site in his youth. "There was no ghost," he wrote, "only the weight of waiting. Some houses remember better than people do, but others disagreed." That summer, a series of unseasonal fires struck the abandoned levee settlements near the river. Witnesses described seeing a glow moving slowly through the mist, like a procession of lanterns winding toward the old bayou road. No one dared follow. For a brief time afterward, the story resurfaced in sermons and tavern tales. People said the widow's guests had finally come to join her, that after 40 years the table was at last full. Others said the fires were only lightning strikes, and that every decade or so, the land itself burns to forget. Yet when the wind blew north across the marshes, travelers swore they could still smell onions, pork fat, and lilac. The scent hung there long after the rain. In the quiet, it was easy to believe she had never truly left, that the supper was still waiting for one more chair. By the early 1920s, the Delta had changed, at least on the surface. New levees stood where once there was only river mist, and paved roads crept outward from Helena and Mariana. But the lowlands around Old River Bend remained untouched, half swamp, half memory. To most, it was just another patch of flooded earth. To those who knew the stories, it was still her ground. In 1922, a pair of road surveyors, Frank Blanton and Otis Reed, were assigned to chart a new route connecting the river settlements. Their correspondence, preserved in county engineering files, mentions the Halbrook section only once. Ground unstable, structure remains visible, chimney and brick arch. Local guide refuses to proceed past the stand of cypress, claims it belongs to her still. Reed's field sketch shows the faint outline of a square foundation surrounded by tree roots. He drew 6 dots where the table would have stood, labeling them sunken stones. The note beneath reads simply, "No sound but water until we turn to leave." That same year, the Helena World published a column by Oscar Vail's successor, reflecting on old Delta legends. In it, he wrote, "The widow's feast endures because the Delta endures. Both know how to hold what the world tries to forget." He referenced the earlier article by Professor Grayson, suggesting that such stories were not superstition but survival, a way to remember hunger, loneliness, and the violence of isolation. His essay quoted a farmer who had once worked near the site. "She fed what the Delta couldn't bury." Those words stayed with readers. For a brief few months, people began visiting the area again, journalists, photographers, and curious travelers, hoping to glimpse the remnants of a legend. They found almost nothing, only a partial wall, its bricks salt-eaten and pale, and a scattering of china fragments that clinked faintly when the wind blew. A researcher from Little Rock, Miss Eleanor Ward, gathered several of these fragments for a museum display on Folk Mysteries of the Delta. Within days of her arrival home, the pieces had blackened and cracked. Ward noted in her letter to the curator, "The china smells faintly of meat. It will not stay clean." That letter, dated July 1923, is the last documented contact anyone had with the physical remnants of the Halbrook estate. By 1925, the area was reclassified again, this time as Government Wetland Reserve. Maps omitted the Halbrook name entirely, the tract renamed Section 14A Marsh Preservation. Yet the river people kept using the old term, the Widow's Table. And still, each spring, when the fog rolled in over the cypress, fishermen reported a familiar scent drifting across the water, broth and lilac, faint and persistent. It was said that if you listened closely, you could hear the scrape of a chair, the slow rustle of a dress, and a soft voice, calm and patient, whispering, "Won't you sit?" By 1927, nature reclaimed what little remained of the Halbrook land. That spring, the Great Mississippi Flood, one of the most devastating in American history, tore through the Arkansas Delta, drowning farms, homes, and towns alike. Whole communities disappeared beneath muddy water. But when the flood receded, something unexpected happened. Locals said the Halbrook chimney still stood, half submerged, yet unmoved. Government engineers recorded its coordinates, but listed it only as unidentified structure, pre-flood origin. Among the workers was Foreman Clyde Peters, whose later recollections in the Arkansas River Reclamation Reports note, "The old chimney remains upright. All else around it flattened. The river must favor it." That phrase, repeated in taverns and churchyards, gave the legend new breath. Some said the widow's house had never truly fallen, that it merely waited for the world to rise back to meet it. Others swore the flood had revealed its cellar, an open moor of black stone beneath the silt, and that strange noises were heard from within at night. One report from a relief worker named Henry Loudon, dated June 1927, describes an odor of soup and lilac drifting over the floodplain when the evening winds shifted. He chalked it up to decay, but his fellow workers refused to camp near the area after dark. During reconstruction, a new levee was proposed directly across the Halbrook tract. Engineers drew plans, took measurements, and even brought in fill dirt. But on the second day, the machinery sank into the mud as though the ground itself had opened. No lives were lost, but the project was abandoned. Local superstition branded the site the table that won't be moved. Academics like Dr. C.L. Henry, still writing into the 1920s, referenced this event in their studies of Delta folklore. He noted that in every generation, the widow's story adapted, from whispered ghost tale to cautionary parable, from supper to storm. He quoted an old fisherman saying, "The Delta don't flood, it remembers." His work echoed much of what modern summaries, like the Arkansas Delta article on Wikipedia, describe about the region's persistent identity, a landscape where memory and disaster intertwine. By autumn, when the floodwaters finally receded, volunteers sent to clear the wreckage of Old River Bend reported finding a narrow clearing surrounded by reeds. In its center stood a single waterlogged chair. It was facing east. The men left it there. After the 1927 flood, the Halbrook tract was finally marked as uninhabitable, and official interest ceased. But among the locals who stayed behind, a quiet belief persisted, that when the rivers rise, they are answering an old invitation, called from beneath the mud and the years. Those who pass by the bayou on calm nights still claim they can see ripples that move against the current, as if stirred by unseen hands, and sometimes faintly the smell of stew. By the close of 1929, the Halbrook name had vanished from every official record in Phillips County. The courthouse listed the tract as lost acreage. Even the locals who once feared it spoke of it now as if it were a dream. But the Arkansas Delta has never been kind to forgetting. That winter, the river froze thinly for the first time in years. Hunters crossing the marsh near Old River Bend found the outline of a foundation showing through the frost, square, perfect, like a scar refusing to fade. One of them, Silas Drew, swore he saw footprints leading to its center. Not pressed down, he said later, but raised up, like the earth wanted to remember who walked there. A week later, Drew's daughter told neighbors she heard knocking sounds at their door every night at the same hour. When she opened it, no one stood outside. Only the smell of lilac and broth drifted in on the cold air. The Helena newspaper ran one final column that February, quietly marking 50 years since the first reports of the Widow's Feast. Its closing paragraph read, "The Delta endures. It swallows what it loves and it keeps what it cannot forgive." So perhaps it is right that Mrs. Halbrook's table still waits somewhere beneath the mud. The author, unsigned, is believed to have been Oscar Vale's apprentice, now an old man himself. In his notes, he quoted from Professor Grayson's earlier essays about the Arkansas Delta, as echoed today in that same region's historical documentation on Wikipedia. Here, the living and the dead are separated only by water, and even that boundary shifts with the rain. After that, the widow's story slipped into legend completely. The area around her former home became nothing but reeds and shallow pools. No house, no foundation, no visible trace of a life once lived. Only, some said, the feeling that if you lingered too long, the ground beneath your feet would soften, as though asking you to sit. For decades afterward, fishermen swore that on still nights their lines tugged without cause, as if caught on something deep below. One man, pulling his net at dawn, claimed he brought up a porcelain plate unbroken and clean. He left it where it fell, and when he looked again, it was gone. And so the tale remains unfinished, not proven, not denied. The river keeps her secrets, and the delta keeps its silence. To this day, no one truly knows whether Mrs. Halbrook was real, or merely the voice of the land itself, mourning through the centuries. But every spring, when the bayou blooms with fog and the air smells faintly of supper, people still whisper the same thing: she's serving again. The story of the widow Halbrook ends, as all Delta stories do, not in resolution, but in remembrance. And somewhere beneath the cypress and the shifting mud, a chair remains empty, waiting for one more guest,